Most people think they know the Apache. They have seen them in movies, painted faces, war cries, riding horses across dusty canyons. Hollywood gave the world a version of the Apache that was loud, violent, and simple. But the real Apache people were something the screen could never hold. They were quiet like the desert before a storm. They were patient like the hawk that circles for an hour before it dives. And they carried a grief so deep that most outsiders never got close enough to even smell it. This is not a movie. This is not a legend passed down around a fire to make children sit still. This is the story of one man, Raymond Chishi, who walked into the Sonoran Desert alone, broke into pieces no one could see, and came back out with something burning in his chest that the world needed to hear. Some people called what happened to him a breakdown. His grandmother called it a returning. The difference between those two words is the difference between understanding Apache life and completely missing it. Raymond did not choose to go public with his story easily. He sat on it for years. He watched television shows get it wrong. He watched textbooks in schools erase his people or shrink them into a single paragraph between the Navajo and the Comanche. He watched tourists visit his land and take photographs of red rock formations and drive away thinking they had experienced something sacred. Every time, something in him tightened. Every time, he told himself it was not his job to educate the world. But the desert had already decided otherwise. The desert had already marked him. And a man who has been marked by something that vast does not get to stay quiet forever. Raymond Chishi was born in 1974 in a small community on the San Carlos Apache Reservation in southeastern Arizona. The land there does not welcome strangers easily. The sun is aggressive. The soil is pale and cracked in summer. Cactus grows in every direction: saguaro, prickly pear, cholla, and, if you do not know what you are doing, every plant out there will find a way to draw blood. But Raymond grew up knowing that land the way most children know their own bedroom in the dark. He could navigate it without thinking. He could read the sky the way his grandfather had taught him, not as poetry, but as information. As survival. His grandfather, a man named Chester Chishi, was one of the last people on the reservation who still spoke the Western Apache language fluently without mixing it with English. Chester was a quiet man who said very little but meant everything he said. Raymond used to follow him around the property as a small boy, not because anyone told him to, but because being near Chester felt like standing in the shade on a hot day. There was relief in it. There was something solid. Chester taught Raymond things that did not have names in English. He taught him how to read animal tracks, not just to identify the animal, but to understand what the animal was feeling when it passed through, whether it was scared, whether it was hunting, whether it was injured. He taught Raymond that the desert was not empty. It was the most full place on earth. Every stone, every insect, every shift in wind was part of a conversation that had been going on for thousands of years. The Apache did not live in the desert. They were part of it. There was no separation. But Raymond grew up in two worlds at once, and that split never fully healed. 5 days a week, he sat in a school where the curriculum began American history with European arrival. Where his people appeared only in the context of conflict, resistance, raids, battles, surrender. Where Geronimo, one of the most complex and deeply principled leaders the Apache ever produced, was reduced to a fierce but ultimately defeated warrior whose name American soldiers yelled while jumping out of planes. Raymond sat in those classrooms and felt something harden inside him that he did not fully understand until he was much older. He was not an angry child. People who knew him then describe him as watchful. He paid attention to everything. He listened more than he spoke. His teachers thought he was shy. His grandmother thought he was wise. His mother thought he was carrying something too heavy for a child. She was probably right on both of the last two counts. School did not break him. What came later did that job more thoroughly. Raymond left the reservation at 18 to attend Arizona State University in Tempe. It was the first time he had lived among a majority white population for any significant stretch of time, and the experience was a kind of education no classroom could provide. He was not treated with open hostility, nothing so simple or clean as that. It was subtler. It was the way people looked at him when he mentioned where he was from. The slight pause. The overcompensating interest. Oh wow, that's so fascinating, I love native culture, from people who had never set foot on reservation land and could not have located San Carlos on a map. It was the Halloween costumes he saw at parties, feathered headdresses worn by drunk college students who thought they were being edgy and fun. It was the professor who called on him specifically, in front of the whole lecture hall, to give the Native American perspective on a chapter about westward expansion, as if Raymond personally represented every indigenous nation on the continent. He finished his degree in environmental science. He came back to San Carlos. He took a job with a tribal environmental program, monitoring water quality and land erosion. It was important work. The reservation had serious environmental challenges: contaminated water sources, land degradation from past mining activity, drought conditions that were worsening every decade. Raymond threw himself into the work and, for a while, that was enough. The work gave him purpose. It kept his mind focused and his hands busy. But grief is patient. It waits. His grandfather Chester died in 2003. Raymond was 29 years old. Chester went quietly, in his own bed, surrounded by his family, which by Apache standards was a good death, a death with dignity and presence. Raymond held his grandfather's hand at the end. He sat with the body for a long time after Chester stopped breathing. Something left the room that Raymond could not name, and something entered him at the same moment that he also could not name. He went through the ceremonies. He participated in everything the way he was supposed to. He did not fall apart in front of anyone. He waited until he was alone to fall apart. What followed Chester's death was a slow erosion. Not dramatic. Raymond did not stop showing up to work or start doing anything that others could clearly point to as wrong. He was simply less present. The watchful quality that had always defined him turned inward. He stopped spending time outdoors the way he used to. He stopped talking to his grandmother as often. He slept too much or not at all, alternating between the two in a pattern that left him always exhausted. He ate without tasting. He moved through his days like a man walking through water. His mother noticed first. Then, his older sister. They talked to each other about it the way Apache women talk about things that concern them, carefully, without rushing, circling the subject before coming to it directly. His grandmother, who was 81 years old and had seen grief in many forms, said something that no one else in the family fully understood at the time. She said, "Raymond is between places. He has not decided yet which one to come back from." Everyone assumed she was speaking metaphorically. She was not. In the spring of 2005, Raymond told his supervisor he needed to take 2 weeks of personal leave. He packed a bag, not much, just water, dried food, a knife, a blanket, and a small medicine bundle his grandfather had left him. He drove his truck to a stretch of desert on the eastern edge of the reservation, left the truck on the side of a dirt road, and walked into the land alone. He did not tell anyone exactly where he was going. He did not bring a phone. He told his mother he would be back in 2 weeks, and he told her not to worry, and she knew both things were probably not entirely true. What Raymond was doing had a context within Apache tradition that does not translate neatly into modern language. It was not simply a vision quest. The term belongs to other nations and has been borrowed and diluted and commercialized until it means almost nothing. What Raymond was doing was older and more personal than any ceremony with a name. He was going back to the land because the land was where Chester had told him all answers eventually lived. He was going because grief had been sitting in his chest for 2 years and he did not know how to discharge it in any world that involved other people. He was going because something in him was so broken that only something vast enough could hold all the broken pieces without flinching. The Sonoran Desert in April is not yet the furnace it becomes by July, but it is no gentle place. Temperatures during the day can reach into the 90s. At night they drop fast, sometimes 30 degrees in a matter of hours. The land is full of things that can kill a person who is not paying attention. Rattlesnakes. Scorpions. Dehydration that comes on faster than most people expect. Disorientation, especially in terrain that looks the same in every direction if you do not know how to read it. Raymond walked for 4 hours on the first day before he made camp. He found a spot near a dry wash, sheltered on one side by a rock formation that faced west. He set out his blanket and sat watching the sun go down over the desert. The colors were extraordinary. The sky went from blue to orange to a deep purple that looked almost painted. It was the kind of sunset that makes people who have never seen the desert want to move there immediately. Raymond barely noticed it. He was too far inside himself to register beauty. He ate a small amount. He drank water carefully, rationing. He listened to the desert settle into its night sounds, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustling of something small in the brush nearby, the dry wind moving through the cholla. And then, for the first time in 2 years, he cried. Not the polite, managed kind of crying that happens in front of other people. The other kind. The kind that takes over the whole body and sounds nothing like what people expect crying to sound like. It came out of him in waves, and each wave felt like it was pulling something up from somewhere very deep, and the desert received it without comment. He cried for Chester. He cried for the language Chester had spoken that Raymond only partially knew, that was disappearing from the earth one elder at a time. He cried for every classroom where his people had been made small. He cried for the Halloween costumes and the professor and the tourists with their cameras. He cried for the contaminated water and the cracked land and the children on the reservation who grew up knowing they were from somewhere meaningful but were constantly being told by the outside world that they were from somewhere defeated. He cried until there was nothing left to cry with, and then he lay back on his blanket and looked at the stars, and the stars looked back, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. That was the first night. There were 13 more to come. And what happened across those 13 nights and 14 days would change Raymond Chishi in ways that took him years to understand and even longer to find words for. The desert was not finished with him. It had brought him out there for a reason, and reasons in that landscape do not reveal themselves quickly. They arrive the way the Apache people have always moved, quietly, on their own schedule, in their own way. Patient as the hawk. Still as the stone. Impossible to ignore once they finally show themselves. The world would eventually hear what Raymond had to say. But, first, the desert had to finish its work. By the third day, Raymond had stopped counting hours. This was not something that happened by accident. It happened because the desert does not operate on human schedules, and the longer a person stays inside it without the noise of modern life pulling at them, the more the body begins to sync with older rhythms. Sunrise and sunset replaced morning and evening. Hunger and thirst replaced mealtimes. The temperature of the air told him what time of day it was better than any clock could. He woke when the light changed. He rested when the heat became too severe. He moved in the early mornings and late afternoons, the way desert animals move, avoiding the crushing midday sun. His water supply was the one thing he tracked carefully. Chester had taught him which desert plants held moisture and how to access it: the barrel cactus, the prickly pear pads, the shallow roots of certain shrubs that drew up groundwater in the dry wash. Raymond used these sources to supplement what he had carried, and, while he was never comfortable, he was never truly desperate. His body knew this land. Even after years of living in houses with running water and grocery stores, that deep knowledge had not left him. It was in his hands and his feet and his sense of smell. It had been placed there by a grandfather who understood that knowledge written in the body lasts far longer than knowledge written on paper. On the fourth day, he found tracks. He crouched and studied them in the fine dust near a dry stream bed. Mountain lion. The prints were large and perfectly formed, the toes spread wide, the central pad clearly defined. The tracks were fresh, maybe 2 hours old, given the way the edges had softened slightly in the morning heat. The lion had been moving northwest, unhurried, the stride long and even. Not hunting. Walking. Raymond followed the tracks for a while, not trying to catch up, just reading. The lion had paused at a flat rock and sat there for some time. The impression was deeper, spread differently. It had been resting. Looking at something. Raymond stood on the same rock and looked in the direction the lion had been facing, which was southeast, back toward the way Raymond had come. From that elevation he could see a long sweep of the valley below, pale and vast and shimmering in the early light. Whatever the lion had been watching out there, Raymond could not know. But he stayed on that rock for almost an hour, and by the time he climbed down, something inside him had shifted just slightly. He could feel it the way you feel a fever beginning to break, not gone yet, but changed. His grandfather had told him once that mountain lion was a teacher of boundaries. Not aggressive, not territorial in the way small-minded things are territorial, but deeply clear about what was theirs and what was not. Chester had said, "Mountain lion does not explain itself to anyone. It simply knows what it knows, and it walks accordingly." Raymond had been 19 when Chester said this, and he had nodded and filed it away as the kind of wisdom that sounds important but whose meaning reveals itself only later. Standing in that desert on the fourth day, he finally understood what Chester had meant. Raymond had spent his whole adult life explaining himself, justifying his identity, defending his people's history against the version the outside world preferred. He had been doing it without realizing he was doing it, and it had cost him something essential. The mountain lion did not explain itself to the desert. And the desert did not ask it to. On the seventh night, Raymond got sick. He had been careful with his food and water, but the desert has its own ways of testing a person, and something had found its way into his system, perhaps from a plant he had used, perhaps simply from exposure and depletion. His body temperature spiked. He became nauseated, then feverish. He lay in his shelter and sweated through his shirt and shook with chills even as his skin burned. He was too far from the truck to get there safely in his condition, and walking at night in a fever through terrain like that would have been genuinely dangerous. He did not panic. This is important to understand about Raymond, and about what his upbringing had given him. Panic is a response to the feeling that things should not be happening the way they are happening. Chester had specifically worked to remove that response from Raymond as a young person, not by making him hard or emotionally flat, but by teaching him that the desert, like life, does not owe anyone a smooth road. What is happening is always what is happening. The question is never why is this happening to me, but always what do I do now? Raymond focused on his breathing. He drank small amounts of water frequently to keep from dehydrating in the fever. He stayed still and let his body do what it needed to do. He slept in fragments between waves of heat and cold, and between those fragments he drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep and not quite waking. He was not hallucinating, he was clear enough about that distinction. But his mind in that half-state moved through things he had not allowed himself to think about in years. The faces of people. His grandfather's voice speaking in Western Apache, saying words that Raymond understood in meaning but could no longer fully reproduce. The smell of his grandmother's kitchen. A specific afternoon from childhood when he had sat on a rock behind the house and watched a red-tailed hawk hunt for nearly an hour, and the satisfaction he had felt when the hawk finally dove and came up with something in its talons, not a cruel satisfaction, but the deep, clean satisfaction of watching something fulfill its purpose completely. He thought about his people's history the way you think about something when you are stripped of the ability to perform your relationship to it. Not as a cause to defend. Not as an identity to protect. But as a simple, true thing that existed regardless of whether anyone outside of it acknowledged it correctly. The Apache had been here for thousands of years before anyone with a written history arrived to record them. They would, in some form, be here after. The distortion in textbooks and movies was real and it caused real harm. Raymond was not going to minimize that. But somewhere in the fever space of that seventh night, he understood something that he had been too angry to access before. The distortion did not define the thing it distorted. The Apache were not the movie version. They were never the movie version. The movie version said more about the people who made the movies than it said about anyone who had ever lived in that desert. His grandfather had known this. His grandmother had always known it. Raymond had known it in theory. That night, burning and shaking in the red dirt of his ancestral land, he finally knew it all the way through. By morning the fever had broken. He was weak and very thirsty and his mouth tasted like metal. He drank slowly and lay still for most of the day, eating a small amount and resting. By the following morning he was able to move normally again. But the illness had done something to him, stripped a layer off that the grief and the anger had been hiding behind. He felt raw. He felt lighter. He felt, for the first time in 2 years, actually present in his own body. On the 10th day, he began to talk. Not to himself exactly. To the land. This is another thing that does not translate well into modern language without sounding like something it is not. Raymond was not praying in the way most Western readers would understand the word. He was not asking for anything. He was simply speaking out loud in a mixture of English and the fragments of Western Apache he carried about the things that had been living in him silently for years. About Chester. About the reservation. About the environmental work he had been doing and why it mattered and how exhausting it was to fight for something that the outside world treated as either a noble cause or a lost cause, but almost never as simply the right and obvious thing. He talked about the water. The water on the reservation had been contaminated by copper mining operations decades ago, and the fight to clean it up was an ongoing battle against bureaucracy and corporate interest and the simple fact that nobody with power seemed to genuinely care whether Apache families had clean drinking water. Raymond had dedicated years to this fight. It had ground him down. He talked about that. He talked about the loneliness of being the person in every room who carries the weight of a history that everyone around you has simplified or ignored. He talked about his own failures, the times he had gotten too angry and said things badly, the times he had gone quiet when he should have spoken, the times he had let someone's ignorance pass without correction because he was just too tired that day to take it on. The desert received all of it. The rock and the sky and the dry wind and the cactus and whatever creatures were listening in the brush. None of it judged him. None of it told him he was too much or too angry or too quiet or too loud. It simply held what he gave it and kept existing. That is what vast things do. On the 12th day, he sat down and spent several hours going through his grandfather's medicine bundle. He had not opened it since Chester died. He had carried it for 2 years and never been able to make himself look inside it. Alone in the desert with nothing left to protect himself with, no distractions, no schedule, no performance of being okay, he finally opened it and went through each item carefully. There was a small piece of turquoise wrapped in leather. A hawk feather, old and slightly bent. A piece of bark from a tree Raymond recognized, Apache plume, a shrub that grew in the higher elevations. A folded piece of paper with something written on it in Chester's careful, old-fashioned handwriting. Raymond unfolded it. The words were in Western Apache. Raymond could read some of it and guessed at the rest. It was a short description of the land, the specific places on the reservation that Chester considered sacred, not in the religious sense that word usually carries but in the sense of being irreplaceable. Places that carried memory. Places where the ground remembered things that had happened above it. At the bottom of the paper, in English, as if Chester had known that Raymond's grasp of the language was incomplete and had wanted to make sure this part was clear, 3 short lines. You know who you are, asterisk, tell them, asterisk, the land is listening, asterisk. Raymond read it several times. He sat with it for a long time. The sun moved across the sky and the shadow of the rock he was sitting against stretched and shortened and stretched again, and he did not move. Something was settling into him with the slow gravity of something that was always supposed to be there. A direction. Not a plan, plans come later. A direction. A sense of which way was forward. He had come to the desert because he was broken. He had come because grief had eaten a hole in him and he did not know how to fill it with anything available in ordinary life. He had come, if he was being honest with himself, because a part of him had not been entirely sure he wanted to come back. That was the thing no one in his family talked about directly, though his grandmother had known it. The part about being between places. The part about not having decided yet which one to return from. The desert had made the decision for him. Not by giving him peace exactly, peace is too clean a word for what happens in a place like that. The desert had given him something rawer and more honest. It had shown him what was real. It had taken away everything that was not, and what was left, stripped bare under a sky that did not care about anyone's feelings, was a man with a story that belonged to a people who deserved to have it told correctly. That was the thing left standing after everything else had been burned away by heat and grief and a 7-night fever and the silence of 14 days alone in the oldest place he knew. He picked up his grandfather's paper and folded it carefully back along its original creases. He put it in the medicine bundle and closed it. He looked out at the desert, at the pale expanse of it running to the horizon in every direction, at the sky above it which was a blue so deep it looked almost purple near the edges, and he said something out loud in Western Apache that he had not said since Chester taught it to him. It was a phrase of acknowledgement. A way of saying, I see this. I am here. I have heard. Then, he picked up his blanket and his water and began walking back toward the truck. 2 days later he drove off the dirt road and back onto the highway. He was 20 pounds lighter, sunburned from his forehead to the backs of his hands, and quieter than any person his family had ever seen him. His mother took one look at him and held him for a very long time and said nothing. His grandmother looked at his face from across the room and nodded once, and that nod contained everything neither of them could say. The returning had happened. What came next was the telling. Raymond did not rush. That was the first thing people who later followed his work came to understand about him. He was not a man who rushed. After returning from the desert, he spent the better part of a year simply living. Working his environmental job. Sitting with his grandmother in the evenings. Spending weekends out on the land, not alone and not in the desperate way he had gone before, but with his nephews and a cousin who was 12 years old and who reminded Raymond of himself at that age, watchful, quiet, absorbing everything. He taught the boy some of what Chester had taught him. How to read tracks. How to find water. How to listen to what the desert was actually saying versus what people assumed it was saying. The anger he had carried for years had not disappeared. Raymond was honest about that with himself. But it had changed its shape. Before the desert, the anger had been reactive. It flared up when something outside him triggered it, a careless comment, a harmful image, a meeting with a government official who spoke about the reservation as though its people were a problem to be managed rather than a community to be respected. That kind of anger burns hot and fast and leaves a person exhausted. After the desert, the anger was slower and more focused. It was the kind that builds things rather than just responds to things. It had found a purpose. In 2006, Raymond started writing. He had no particular ambition about it at first. It was not a book he was planning. It was notes, private, written in a journal he kept at home. He wrote about Chester. He wrote about growing up on the reservation and what that world actually looked and felt and smelled like, the specific quality of light on the red rock in early morning, the sound of relatives talking in the next room in a language that was disappearing from the earth, the food his grandmother made and the way she moved in the kitchen and the prayers she said before eating that connected the food back to the land it came from. He wrote about things that had no equivalent in the world most Americans assumed was the only world there was. He wrote about the environmental fight, the copper contamination, the water testing, the meetings with tribal council and federal agencies and mining company representatives who showed up in expensive suits and brought PowerPoint presentations full of numbers that minimized harm and projected timelines that never came true. He wrote about sitting in those meetings and knowing that the people across the table did not see the same thing when they looked at that land. They saw resource. They saw liability. They saw a line item. Raymond saw home. He saw the place his grandfather had been born and his great-grandmother before that and generations before her, all the way back past the reach of any written record into a time when the Apache and the desert were so thoroughly woven together that the idea of separating them would have made no sense to anyone. He wrote all of this in his journal for about 2 years. Then, his grandmother got sick. She was 83 by then, and the illness was serious but not sudden. She had been slowing for a couple of years in the way very old people slow, carefully and with dignity, like a river that knows where it is going and is not in a hurry to get there. She remained sharp and present right up to the end, and in the months before she died she and Raymond spent more time together than they had since he was a child. He would sit with her in the evenings, and she would talk. She told him things she had never told him before. Not because she had been hiding them, but because she had been waiting until she was certain he was ready to hold them properly. She talked about the long walk, not the Navajo one that American history textbooks sometimes include, but the Apache removals and relocations that had shattered community structures and severed people from land their entire identity was rooted in. She talked about her own grandmother, who had lived through a period of extreme violence and displacement and who had survived it by carrying her knowledge and her identity so deep inside herself that no external force could locate and destroy it. She talked about the boarding school system, the government-run schools that Apache children had been forcibly sent to in the late 1800s and, well into the 1900s, where they were prohibited from speaking their language, wearing their clothes, practicing their traditions, or even using their names. The explicit stated goal of those schools was cultural erasure. She said this plainly, without performance of outrage. It was simply what had happened. It was fact. She told Raymond that the things she was telling him were not secrets. They were history. Real history, not the version in textbooks. And she told him that the reason this history mattered was not to make white people feel guilty. Guilt was not useful to anyone. The reason it mattered was that you cannot understand the present condition of the Apache people without understanding what shaped them. You cannot understand the poverty rates and the health statistics and the struggles over land and water and sovereignty that continue today without understanding the deliberate and systematic dismantling that preceded them. Context is not excuse-making. Context is accuracy. And accuracy was the thing Raymond had always wanted most. His grandmother died in the spring of 2008. Raymond was 34 years old. He handled the grief differently this time, not because he felt it less, but because the desert had taught him that grief does not require a container. You do not have to put it somewhere. You can simply feel it and keep existing at the same time. He cried at the right moments. He participated in the ceremony. He sat with his family and let himself be held by the community that had always been around him, and this time he did not try to process it alone. When the hardest days came, he drove out to the land and walked for a while, and that was enough. Within a year of his grandmother's death, Raymond decided to take his journal and do something with it. He was not a writer by training and he did not know how publishing worked and he did not have connections to anyone in media or academia. What he had was the writing itself, which was honest and specific and written in the simple, direct way that his grandfather had always spoken, nothing extra, nothing performed, just the clear shape of what was real. He submitted a long essay to a small Indigenous Affairs publication. They accepted it. It appeared in print in late 2009. The essay was about the Western Apache language, its current state of near extinction, what was being lost with each fluent speaker who died, and what was being done on the reservation to document and teach it. He wrote about Chester, specifically Chester's voice, Chester's particular way of explaining things, the expressions in Western Apache that had no equivalent in English because they described relationships between people and land that English had never needed to name. The response surprised him. Not just from native readers, though those letters and messages meant the most, but from outside the community. People who had never set foot in Arizona and knew very little about the Apache wrote to tell him that something in the essay had reached them. That the specificity of it had made them feel the loss of something they had not known existed. One letter came from a professor of linguistics at a university in the Northeast who wanted to know if Raymond would be willing to speak to his students. A journalist who covered Indigenous affairs for an online magazine asked if he would agree to an interview. A woman who ran a non-profit focused on Indigenous language preservation wrote to ask if Raymond's tribe had been in contact with their organization. Raymond answered every letter. He agreed to the interview. He said yes to the professor, and he flew to the East Coast for the first time in his life and stood in a university lecture hall and looked out at a room full of students who knew almost nothing about him or his people, and he told them the truth. Not the angry version, he had moved past needing the anger to do the work for him. He told them the accurate version. He told them what Apache life actually looked like, in its texture and its dailiness and its ongoing complexity. He told them about the language. He told them about the land and the water and the environmental fight. He told them about his grandfather and his grandmother and the things they had carried and the things they had passed on. He told them about the boarding schools and the removals in the plain, factual language his grandmother had used, and he watched the faces in the room change as the information landed. He told them about Geronimo. Not the movie version. The real man, a Bidanco Apache leader named Goyle who watched his wife and children be murdered by Mexican soldiers in 1851 and spent the rest of his long life fighting to protect his people's right to exist on their own land. A man of extraordinary strategic intelligence who was hunted by thousands of American and Mexican troops for years and was never actually defeated in battle. He surrendered in 1886 only after being promised conditions that were immediately violated. A man who was then held as a prisoner of war for the remaining 23 years of his life and was never allowed to return to his homeland, who died in 1909 still a prisoner, still on foreign land. Raymond told them this story and the room was very quiet, and a student in the third row raised his hand and said, "Why didn't we learn any of this?" And Raymond said, "That is the right question. That is exactly the right question to be asking." After that visit, Raymond became something he had never planned to become. Not a celebrity, nothing so shallow as that. But a voice. He wrote more essays. He agreed to speak at schools and universities and eventually at policy conferences where the people in the room had actual power to affect things that affected Apache communities. He never became comfortable with attention. He was still the watchful, quiet man he had always been. But he had learned to use language the way Chester had used his hands when tracking, with precision, with patience, with complete intention. Every word placed exactly where it needed to go. He continued his environmental work throughout all of it. In fact, the advocacy and the environmental work became inseparable. In 2012, Raymond was part of a coalition that successfully challenged a mining company's application to expand operations near the reservation watershed. It was a long fight, years of documentation, legal action, testimony, and public pressure. When it was finally resolved in the tribe's favor, Raymond did not celebrate loudly. He drove out to the stretch of desert that would have been destroyed and he sat there for a while, looking at it. Listening. He published his first full book in 2015, a memoir called Between Places, which borrowed his grandmother's phrase for what he had been during those long years of grief. The book covered his childhood, Chester, the university years, the desert, his grandmother's final months, and the decade of speaking and writing that followed. It was not a bestseller in any commercial sense. But it found its readers, and those readers were the right readers, teachers who put it in curricula, young Apache people who wrote to Raymond to tell him they had never seen their actual lives reflected in a book before, indigenous scholars who cited it, journalists who used it as a foundation for their own reporting on Apache affairs. The record was being set straight. Not perfectly, perfection was never the goal, and Raymond was suspicious of anything that claimed to have the final, complete version of any story. But, more accurately, more honestly, with more of the real texture and complexity that had always been present in Apache life and had always been flattened by the outside world's need for simple stories about simple people. Raymond Shishi was 50 years old when he sat down for the interview that eventually brought his story to the widest audience it had yet found. He was sitting in his office on the reservation, surrounded by books and papers and a framed photograph of Chester on the wall behind him. He was asked by the interviewer what he wanted people to take away from everything he had shared over the years. He was quiet for a moment. The interviewer, who had been warned that Raymond sometimes took time before answering, waited. Then, Raymond said, "I want them to know we are still here. Not as a symbol. Not as a lesson. Not as a tragedy or a cause. Just here. The same way the desert is here. Still. Still doing what it has always done. Still full of things most people have never taken the time to learn. That's all. We're still here, and we have been this whole time, and if people want to know who we actually are, the information is available. They just have to want it more than they want the version someone else already made up for them." He looked out the window of the office at the pale land beyond, the red rock in the distance, the enormous sky. Then, he looked back at the interviewer and added, quietly, in a voice that carried everything his grandfather had given him and everything the desert had returned to him and everything his grandmother's final months had placed in his hands, "Chester knew. My grandmother knew. They always knew." And, with that, Raymond Shishi said he had more work to do, and excused himself from the room, and walked back out into the land where all of it had started, and where all of it continued, and where it would continue long after any version of any story had been written down. The desert holds no grudges. It simply remembers everything.